My name is Niyati Dave, and I'm a curator and program manager at Khoj, a contemporary arts organization established in 1997 in New Delhi. I'm joined by Omer, Wasim, and Shahana Rajani, who collaborate under the name Saraab, who are both joining us from Karachi, Pakistan, where they live and work. The Khoj team and I have had the pleasure of working with Omer and Shahana for the last few months in a process that's been equal parts exhilarating, thought provoking, and slightly chaotic. Um, so, just to give you some background on how this collaboration came to be, when TBA 21 had reached out to Khoj to be part of the stage project, Khoj was just about to begin a 3-year project on atmospheric toxicities because Khoj, being in New Delhi, is constantly engaging with the idea of air pollution by virtue of its location and because of its long sort of history of looking at ecologies and cities, Khoj immediately felt the need to step into the conversation around air pollution and use art as a way to bring attention to some of the things happening around that in New Delhi. So when we first began speaking to TBA 21, Pooja Sood, the director of Khoj, immediately sort of said that we should consider doing an open call. And the reasoning behind that was that Khoj also has a long history of working with artists across South Asia. And that's becoming increasingly harder for us to do given the political climate in India. And for us to be talking about air pollution, but only from an Indian perspective, or to be talking about forms of ecological devastation and degradation that, in some sense, transcend borders, but only doing it from a positionality in India sort of made no sense because water and air and the kind of land relations also in this region aren't specific to India alone. There are things that sort of impact ecologies across the borders as well. So for us, it was very important to throw open this open call to all of South Asia. And so even though it seemed like such a gamble to, on this very compressed timeline, do an open call, we went ahead and did it. Um, and I think we're very thankful to both TBA 21 and also to, I'm very thankful to Pooja Sood, who kind of had the courage to say that we can do this. And so, and we're very happy we did that because I think without that, we would not have had the pleasure of reading Saraab, Omer and Shahana's proposal and having the opportunity to work with them for these last few months. So that's how this sort of collaboration came to be. I think when we first read Saraab's proposal that came in from the open call, something that really drew us to it was that it sort of assumes this positionality at the crossroads of the sacred, the non-human, and the ecological. And for us, that was really, really interesting because they kind of talk about the figure of the jinn, which is the mythical being from Islamic cosmology. But then they're also talking about other forms of indigenous knowledges and how large-scale developmental projects in Pakistan, such as the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, um, almost transubstantiate land, memory, and communities into dust, erasure, and commodities. So I kind of want to begin by asking Shahana and Omar about how their project deals with all of these different layers, right? Like there's this one layer that looks at large scale infrastructural development and displacement. There's a layer that speaks to the erasure of indigenous communities and knowledge systems. There's a strong sort of emphasis on sacred ecologies and rituals. And I think I want to begin speaking about this by asking about how in our early conversations, we talked a lot about the Black writer and academic Saidiya Hartman and her idea of the critical fabulation, which is a writing practice that allows how, for animating gaps and silences in archives and um, to make sense of these things that are unspoken or unwritten. And I would really like to know more about how you sort of use that idea to inform your work.
I'm going to quickly start. So development projects that the state is taking on are very, very obscure. They're invisible to us and the entire country, perhaps. So it's an impossible narrative or a story uh, to narrate,
Mhm.
to comprehensively imagine, and an even bigger thing to make entirely visible. And as these developmental infrastructure projects continue, measures of toxicity in the air, land, and water are allowed to exceed the benchmark that's set for livable conditions, right? So this kind of violence is often slow to manifest in human bodies, and that allows the state to kind of continuously sort of take this toxic debt against our bodies, mapping it everywhere.
Mhm.
So it's a planetary debt. And so we decided to call upon the figure of the jinn and to make visible to make visible that which is entirely invisible to us or not entirely visible to us. And jinns also um, are invisible to humans.
Mhm.
And we were thinking about the figure of the jinn to sort of speak nearby, as Trinity Menha would say. Our aim for the project was to collaborate with impossibility, refusing transparency that's expected of us as cultural producers. And we refuse to make things entirely visible,
Mhm.
speaking, not speaking from or to. Instead, we speak with each other and speak with each other and through each other as well.
I think another important kind of element and aspect of the project for us as we entered was also rethinking our ways of knowing and our knowledge paradigms to really think about who is producing knowledge and what counts as knowledge, where does that boundary lie and who is imposing that boundary. So you mentioned Saidiya Hartman and her work around confronting the gaps and erasures of the archive. So to really kind of start by acknowledging that archives, maps, state records are not objective, neutral spaces. They are
Mhm.
right spaces. They're produced by those in power to serve their needs. And so in the face of this impossibility, when the state is so adamant on obscuring, erasing, creating opacity, how can we learn different means of sensing and knowing? And for us, entering and thinking about the realm of the sacred becomes a really important modality and method through which we can address the impossibility of the story, the erasure of the state. And I think one kind of text that I've been really inspired by is M. Jackie Alexander's Pedagogies of the Sacred, where
Mhm.
she really like draws attention to the fact that in the academic space or in public life, um, it's seen as a secular life, and the spiritual is always put into the private realm. It never enters our research practices. It never enters into the way that we see and apprehend the world around us. And so she sort of has this really beautiful passage where she explains that in the realm of the secular, the material is always conceived as tangible, right? So archives, maps, records, all of these documents, while the spiritual is always non-existent or at best invisible. And she sort of talks about the realm of the sacred and the imaginal as that in the realm of the sacred, the invisible constitutes its presence by provoking our attention. It requires from us a different sensorial approach beyond the ocular, beyond the hierarchies of vision and the disembodied gaze, but there's a different kind of affective attunement through which you can understand the entanglements of the world, our present moment of development of infrastructure, of violence better. And over here, just to also explain that when I say imaginal realm, imaginal is not to be confused with imaginary or of the imagination or fantasy, but rather this is a realm, right, in Islamic theology, but also in so many other cultures around the world, where it's seen, the imaginal realm or the sacred realm is seen as a realm between the sensible physical world and the realm of the divine. So it's an intermediate realm in which spirits, angels, and other beings reside. And I think we really use Hartman's kind of understanding and method of critical fabulation to activate this realm, to both, as she says, tell an impossible story, but also to amplify the impossibility of telling it. So there's a lot of tension, there's no resolution. As Omer was saying, it's not about making things transparent, but rather I think revealing the tensions that exist and the impossibility of telling a full story, that we're only telling partial stories.
That I think brings up a lot of sort of threads that we can follow. But I think one thing that I'd like to speak about is what you mentioned about the secular realm and its sort of documents being, the archive, the map, these sort of readable, legible ways of codifying knowledge, but then also like classifying the natural, the physical world, and also social relations in some sense. And I think what's really interesting about your work is that it is rooted deeply in a very specific landscape. And it also traverses, it actually honestly traverses multiple landscapes, all of which have a certain history and all of which also have a very specific materiality. And the way I see it, your work also offers a kind of counterpoint to some of these statist ways of knowing landscapes. So I think it would be really interesting if you could tell us a little more about these areas that you work through and how that landscape itself informed or entered into your making of this work. And maybe also a little bit about how it felt for you as creative practitioners to encounter that landscape, because I remember from our conversations that it is a very visceral and sort of stark landscape, and I think it brings out it sort of like encountering it does allow for some of those affective attunements that you spoke about.
Maybe Omer will answer that, but maybe before quickly, I can also just introduce our kind of relationship and our interest in jinns, sort of as a segue into then thinking about how we approach these landscapes differently through the specter of the jinn. So the jinn is a figure that repeatedly comes up everywhere, right? That in, I think, all research projects over many years of very different themes and topics I've conducted, the jinn stories just have a way of popping up everywhere. And I think for us, the jinn is not so much this mythical, distant, superstitious kind of figure, but is very much part of the reality and the world that we inhabit. And so in our over time, we've heard so many different kinds of jinn stories, which really open up different relationalities, of course, to other beings and other worlds, but also really help us to unsettle the ways that we think about space, time, and of course, then also of landscape. So, for instance, the very earliest jinn stories I remember is when I was younger, I had a Quran teacher, and she would come over to our house and she would teach us to read the Quran. And she was one of the first people that I really remember narrating a lot of jinn stories. She introduced the figure of the jinn to me, that, you know, these are beings made of air and fire. They're mentioned in the Quran, and they are part of our world and our life. And she would really tell us that, you know, when you're entering your room or any space, and if there's no one there, don't assume that that space is empty. Because even though you cannot see, this room is full of other beings who are living and sharing the space with you, right? So she would say things like, both scary and fascinating things to me as a child, where she'd be like, if you enter a room, greet the jinn. Or if you're moving through a room or doing something disruptive, warn the jinn, take permission from the jinn to make changes. And I think the two things that very early on that it told me was, right, of course, our own kind of assumptions of always assuming that either land is empty, air is empty, right? Of constantly returning to blankness and emptiness. And I think the jinns refuse that blankness always, and they remind us that we're sharing this space with other beings always, but also that these beings are mortal, that human actions disrupt them, affect them, that in some ways through the air connects both of our realms and worlds. And so our actions have consequences, not just for humans ourselves, but also other beings. And I think as a child to realize these things so early on was, I think it filled me with great wonder for the world, because I had parents who really did not believe in all of these things, thought that these were sort of superstitious thoughts. But I think it also, of course, inculcated a sense of fear. And so, yeah, so as I began working, I again, the jinn stories have always just followed me. And so another really popular jinn story that I just like to briefly mention is that I've heard in so many different iterations that the same versions that change ever so slightly is often that when people in or around their homes cut old trees, jinns are known to live in those old trees. Their families dwell in these trees and have been doing so for decades and centuries. And when you cut down that tree, the jinn's family either dies or is injured. And so the jinn seeks retribution and vengeance from the human who has cut the tree and their home down, and causes great pain and suffering to this human. So even at the heart of the story, of course, there's fear. But I think what's so beautiful and interesting about the story is in its circulation, what it's warning people is don't cut trees, right? That stay away from trees, that these are spaces that should be left untouched, that should be protected. And so I feel like in acknowledging the kind of intersection or intersectionality of the sacred, spiritual, and then the natural worlds allows for a really different approach to landscape.
What you were saying, I think that Islam also stresses the invisible realm, right? I mean, and it is considered to be vaster than or bigger than the manifest realm. And so, I mean, the whole concept of al-ghaib comes in the unseen and unknown, and it is fundamental to the ways in which Islam is practiced. And also Islam the Quran opens with Surah Al-Fatiha, in which God is referred to as the Lord of the worlds, not a single sort of world, but multiple worlds. So I mean, the world that we inhabit is punctuated by many things that we don't necessarily see. So I think that we were sort of we looked at the landscape through that lens, and of course, as we were sort of learning more about jinns, we were able to connect sort of things that we were encountering in the landscape to how the jinns sort of their materiality, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So in Islam, God is believed to have created jinns from scorching hot desert winds. And when we were in Thur in Nagar Park is surrounded by Karunjar mountains, and Karunjar mountains are basically made of granite, and granite sort of is a form of igneous rock.
Mm-hmm.
And igneous comes from the Latin word, I wrote this down, so the Latin word which means fire,
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that I think that all of these, so Thur and the landscape, I mean, I think it's made of fire.
Mm-hmm.
So the winds kind of have a natural, are thought to have like a natural connection with deserts. They return to deserts. They live in deserts. And then as we continue looking at other sort of sources, I mean, one particular source that we sort of really enjoyed looking at or learned a lot from was spiritual ecology. And in it, one of the authors said that ideas of the sacred do not emerge in isolation from the landscape. They emerge because of airs, waters, and places,
Mm-hmm.
from the very character of the landscapes uh, in which they're born. And again, three major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, emerged in the deserts of the Middle East. So people have often returned to the desert in search of spirituality, reflection, and becoming one with nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that as the state continues its development and infrastructural projects, I think all indigenous gods and sort of sacred geographies are moved elsewhere, moved from this sort of space that we inhabit to the heavens. So in the process, I mean, I think that all sacred geographies are sort of are negated, they're rendered flat.
No, I think that makes sense. I think also, um, I mean, I guess there's two things that kind of make me want to make me curious. One is to also think about your piece itself and how it opens. It opens with the Gwati ceremony, which again is a practice that's embedded in a landscape. And it would be really great to sort of hear a little bit more about that. But then also this idea um, of like different cosmologies and practices, and what happens um, when they confront other forces, like in this case the China-Pakistan economic corridor, or other sort of developmental projects or displacement. And I think maybe that might be interesting to get into, because I also think that with this idea of negation is quite interesting in the context of your work as well, because I think there is this sort of interplay between the landscape and how it's being changed, then being manifested in the form of affliction or like some sort of physically felt effect, you know. And it would be really great to hear a little bit more about the Gwati ceremony, because I think that's where it sort of that's where you talk about it in the piece.
So when we started the project, of course, we started with centering the figure of the jinn, but in our research, we soon found out that in Baloch communities, there's also another kind of spirit known that they call Gwat. And Gwat in Balochi literally means wind or wind spirits.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there is a sort of, right, the jinns are also made of air and fire, and then Gwats are also wind spirits. And so the air and the wind is really central. So thinking about the growing ecological disturbances as wind is being disturbed, imbalances are being created, toxicity is being unleashed. Gwat and jinn possessions are also increasing in these communities, and they manifest in the bodies of the possessed as fevers, as burnings, as headaches, as chronic illnesses, a variety of things. And one of the many different kind of rituals and healing ceremonies for those who are possessed is something we came across and something that we include in our final piece, and it's called the Kwathi Ceremony. And it's basically this idea that to use music and to use dance to create or recalibrate this imbalance with the air, the wind, and the atmosphere. So it's widely known by many that jinns and gwats love music, they're drawn to it, and it encourages them to come out and manifest themselves more visibly in our realm. And so we actually attended a Gwati ceremony where this music was being played, and the word that they use to describe the process of dance, that as soon as they start playing the music, the jinn or the gwat responds, depending on where they are from, what their preferences are, they respond to different kinds of music. So the Khalifa and the musicians need to keep playing different forms of esoteric spiritual music, which includes zikr, mankabat, sufi kind of practices, songs of different saints, different kinds of evocations to God. And as the possessed person starts to move and dance, the musicians and the healer knows that, okay, this is the kind of music that they like. And so then they start to play that music. And the idea around it is that the dance, or this kind of dance practice or ritual practice, is called dhamal. And it's, again, something that's done quite routinely at Sufi shrines. Dhamal comes from the Persian word dam, breath. So again, it's very much about using music to create a harmony or connection between your breath, your heartbeat, and the drum beat or the music beat, as a way of connecting with the wind, air, and atmosphere, with the spiritual realm, with the invisible realm. And so the music and the act of dhamal, which in Sufi shrines is this kind of ecstatic dance that is done to achieve mystical union with the divine, with the sacred realm, to gain access to the ghaib, as Omer was saying. Here we also saw that in these ceremonies, similar practices are happening to give healing and ease to those who are afflicted by jinns and gwats. But the healers also sort of told us that before, jinns could be removed from those who were possessed, but now those practices and those knowledges have also decreased, they've become lost. And so now possession is more or less seen as permanent, and that this music basically gives ease to the person. It appeases the jinn, it appeases the gwat, it calms them down. And so it's not really a shutting out, but a way for two beings to live with each other in some kind of a balance and in some kind of a harmony. And in that way, for us, this kind of learning about gwat and the rituals and the kind of culture around gwat became really, really interesting, because we felt that it really sees and centers air as something that is sacred, that it sees our soul and spirits as not something that's trapped inside our bodies, but something that needs to constantly be in connection with the outside realm. And in this way, David Abram's work we found really, really interesting, because he really kind of does this very interesting etymology of disenchanted words that we use to talk about air and atmosphere. So he talks about how the word atmosphere comes from the Sanskrit word atma, which means soul and spirit. So we see atmosphere as something neutral, scientific, objective, empty space, but actually it comes from Atma, that the atmosphere also is the place of the spirit and soul, that there's an interconnection between the inside and outside. And, it's so interesting because he does this for so many words, right? He talks about how the very bodily term, I think respiration, has a common root in the Latin word spiritus, which signifies breath and wind, that the word psyche, right, through which psychology, psychotherapy, all of these kind of modern ideas of the individual, of the mind originate in. The root of that word is from a Greek word which didn't mean soul or mind, but meant breath or a gust of wind. And so it became really interesting for us then to realize that so many words that now refer to air as purely passive, as this insensate medium, were derived from words that identified air with so much life and awareness, and that breath, air, and wind were the very substance of the spirit, that it wasn't something that just resided in our bodies. And so I think moving through these landscapes, we really paid attention to the wind and to the air a lot, and to open up this possibility that winds are a means of knowing. They are the kind of glue or portals through which our worlds and worlds beyond us are connected and kind of tethered together almost. And paying attention to that, of course, then required us also to develop different kinds of sensorial methods and registers beyond just the visual. And I think that's been a really interesting process.
Yeah, and that's really amazing. I mean, I think I didn't know some of those, some of the meanings behind those words. And I love that they all sort of also, even at the physical level, imply a sort of transfer between the outside and the inside, right? And that's really fascinating. I also think that speaking also is a navigation of air, and utterances also play with this idea of air traversing through your body and then finding some sort of finding their way to the outside realm. And so I think with that I want to maybe enter into speaking about the piece itself. I mean, for me it was very interesting to listen to the piece in terms of how it constantly shifted between speaking from closer to the jinn to slightly further away to speaking through and from the landscape, both in terms of actually speaking about the landscape, but also the sounds that invoke the landscape. And I think it would be very interesting to maybe talk about that process of actually producing this and deciding how to go about that.
I think that when we started work on this project, we were pretty set on not giving into producing things that that are normally sort of. I mean, I'm not saying that sound is an entirely new medium, but I think that we were sort of working with the idea of denying visuality to the violence of development of infrastructural projects. So because and as Shahana has mentioned, we were sort of thinking about collaborating with and activating other modes of knowing. So we arrived at sound, and arriving at sound was a way of really closely zooming in or listening to the environment, to what was happening around us. And so yeah, and we were fortunate enough to locate Mudassir Sheikh. Mudassir, he's a sound designer, and so we wanted to create this sense of movement as I think that CPEC as a development project or infrastructural project will gut the entire country when it. So we were actually traveling through the landscape, and in that process we wanted to capture that sense of movement.
There is this constant sensation of not just movement in terms of a body moving through space, but also these non-human but other forms of agential things like the wind moving constantly through the landscape. And yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
And I think these are also spaces that are so increasingly and incredibly militarized. So wherever this kind of development, infrastructural work is happening, these lands, of course, have been occupied through immense and brutal force. And so these are spaces that the state and the military guards with much attention, with great attention, great detail. There's immense surveillance, right, that the communities who have been resisting, who have been engaged in struggle against these projects, have also, there's been a lot of kind of enforced disappearances of people going missing, of really kind of violent and brutal action taken by the military against people who are defending their land and their right to live and to breathe. And so in that way, I think taking a camera into these spaces also actually has become really impossible and really difficult, right? Because immediately if you're standing there, a ranger or a paramilitary or someone or the other is going to come and check you, right? Even in Karachi, it's become increasingly difficult to document as a visual artist. And so in these hyper militarized and hyper surveilled spaces, the camera is also simply not a tool that we can use just logistically. So we also had to turn to other modes to be able to go under the radar, to remain undetected. But I think it's also not, it wasn't a matter of convenience. It was a decision also that we made, that for us, the camera is also perpetuates a certain kind of violence. The screen divides, right, separates us from the landscape that we are looking at. It's a very specific kind of colonial regime of visuality that's being perpetuated. And I think we were really interested in moving away from that, in grappling with new modes and methods of witnessing, of documenting, of being present, of conveying what is happening there. And I think these spaces that we travel through, whether it's Gadab, whether it's the Thar Desert, or whether it's the Makran Coast, are all also spaces of strategic invisibility, that the state has been involved in a project of erasing, of obscuring, to render these places as a blank slate, as a tabula rasa, for development to then come and happen easily without opposition. And so in this process, the state has been using visual means to perpetuate this violence, to create obscurity, so that these spaces are constantly evoked in advertisements, in public discourse, as spaces that are barren wastelands. Right, and you constantly see just pictures of like vast desertscapes or empty mountains, and you'll never be shown settlement, habitation, centuries of living and being that mark these landscapes. And so I think we also try to use sound as a almost alternative means to a kind of visuality that is so rooted in colonial violence, that the very act of recording, of holding a camera, also creates a certain form of disembodiment. And I think we wanted to do and produce something that actually centered the body, that centered embodiment, that rewired our senses, that while we're so used to prioritizing the visual and paying attention to what we can see, by denying the visual, I think we wanted to force people to kind of almost hijack our routine experiential modes to rewire our senses, where in this piece, hearing is seeing, right? And that to really think about what different ways of knowing and understanding can be that are not ocular centric.
Yeah, I was just saying that that makes that, yes, absolutely. I think it's also so interesting because so along with this conversation on the stage platform, there's also going to be an accompanying podcast. And for that podcast, we spoke to an academic, Tariq Rahman, who looks at land and changing land relations in Pakistan. And it's so interesting how important and central things like satellite imagery, WhatsApp groups between sort of elites in Pakistan who circulate images and location pins of these areas that are then, of course, become part of these large real estate parcels that get bought up to um, do these large scale housing projects. It's really interesting how even beyond the colonial regime of the visual, those sort of ways of knowing and accessing space remain central to do this practice of swooping in and procuring land. And I feel like it's very powerful in some ways to engage also, like that the sound also does engage with this idea of, as you said, strategic invisibility, but also deliberate opacity in how the state almost hides some of its operations or doesn't let them be seen or documented or spoken about. So that's all I wanted to add. And Omer, if you want to.
Yeah, and then also I think that the landscapes that we were traversing through were also just carved by air, right, over millennia. And I think that the movement of air in the piece also sort of tries to encapsulate that. That the landscape in Balochistan, or the mountains in Balochistan, have been carved by wind. I think my dad is a geologist, and he mentioned that the sand in Nagar Parker, it's basically sort of granite, that the air has kind of made malleable over millennia. So yeah, I think that movement also we wanted to capture, that the landscape that we inhabit, or the landscapes that we travel through, are directly informed by air, and even though it is largely invisible to us.
And also the name Safarnama also implies movement, but then also has like a longer history of a specific sort of travelogue.
Yeah, I think we chose this name, and I think we chose this kind of to appropriate the mode of a travelogue. Of course, it's in conversation to the military gaze, the tourist gaze of kind of packaging these landscapes as picturesque views, which of course also has colonial origins and histories. But I think we also wanted to look back to older practices in the pre-modern era, in the Islamic world, of travel, of intimacy, of understandings of land and geography that were really different from how we see now. And, for instance, in these older kind of geographies that are produced by travelers in the region, land is never separated from the social realm, or it's never seen as just topographical. It's never just seen as a commodity to be extracted, but it's so interconnected to the social world, the natural world, the sacred world, that that kind of, again, the extractive relationship that we have to nature today doesn't exist in these earlier Safarnamas and travelogues, where constantly you see geographies of land are interspersed with geographies of people, geographies and histories of spirits, beings, of wonders of the world, right? Of a fantastic and fabulous geography, of an enchanted world where at the center is not the human, but a whole kind of multiplicity of beings, and the traveler is open to those encounters, to those presences, rather than kind of creating a very disembodied relationship with the space that you occupy while you travel. And I think I also Niyati, wanted to, what you were saying about kind of real estate developments and thinking about kind of the ways in which real estate developments also market themselves, how they represent land, how there's entire circulation on social media of particular kinds of visualities and very particular ways of viewing landscapes. So for the past couple of years now, I've been working in this neighborhood called Gadap, which is on the outskirts of Karachi. And a lot of this research I've done with my friend and kind of long-term collaborator, Zara Malkani. And I think one thing that became really clear to us as we spent time here is the real estate development repeatedly was using three words in all its ads and all its marketing campaigns. And that was Banjar, Gairabad, and Gair Mehfooz. Banjar is barren, Gairabad is uninhabited, no one lives here, and Gair Mehfooz is it's also insecure, it's wild, it needs to be tamed, disciplined, surveilled, securitized. And I think what we realized, of course, that this is not something that the real estate development is doing, but there's a much longer history of the state perpetuating these kinds of imaginaries of peripheral areas around the city in order to legitimize development. And so if we look at the last survey map of Karachi that was done in 2002, you'll see, of course, that there's built area that represents the urban center, but on the periphery, including Gadap, is blank space, right? So how like land is constantly then in mapping practices reduced to white paper, and that these are frontier making projects, right? That it's not that these frontiers exist, but that they are created, that blankness is created. And one thing while we were researching and doing work in Gadap that we encountered that was really kind of fascinating is that in these places we found that the jinns are present in these blank spaces of the map. That when the state is engaged in these really long strategies of erasure of indigenous past and present to legitimize and sanitize development projects, people in these neighborhoods turn to the jinn to remember their past, to remember their histories, where so much, as Omer was saying, sacred geographies are disappearing. The jinn kind of remembers those geographies for people, connects them to it. And there's sort of this really kind of beautiful way in which then the jinn also challenges and undoes our linear understanding of time and temporality. So the jinn, and Anant Taneja has done really incredible work on this, and he's also looking at Delhi, where he's sort of talking about in a state that's so intent on erasing what they find inconvenient pasts, right? That the Muslim histories in the landscape, people there also are turning to the jinn to remember, because jinns have much longer lives than humans. So there are certain jinns who have been around from the time of the Prophet, so centuries. They do die, but they do live much, much longer than human beings. And because their memory and because of their lifespan, they remember and have witnessed so much more than humans have, that they become really important kind of locus points, center points for people to turn to and to speak against erasure. These are then those different means of knowing, right? That for an archive, recording something a jinn has said is just completely unacceptable, right? That doesn't count as knowledge. But then in these communities, knowledge transference is also happening through these really alternate and incredible ways.
That's fantastic. I think for me also, these are also parallel experiences across South Asia in some sense. what you spoke about, this idea of blank space, and I mean, it's frankly disconcerting, but also on some level really hilarious to look at the ways that maps operate, like master plans and where they put things. It that almost seems more fantastical than any sort of non-human entity may, because there's this constant sort of like mapping areas that are densely populated as blank, but then also like reappropriating these lands that would have been commons, or that sort of fall into land and human relationships that predate, these capitalist logics of how land is used, and kind of bringing them back into this sort of regularized and you know formalized fold. So that's something that I think a lot of Indian cities can also attest to. um, yeah, and I think what you said also really, it sort of takes us back to how we opened, um, when you were speaking about the jinns as like holding a form of knowledge that is outside of this status narrative, that's outside of these visual documents or written documents or these codified knowledges that are also, they're not neutral knowledges, they're all knowledges that are deployed for a very particular kind of action in that physical realm. And that kind of takes us then back to this idea of how then do we approach these landscapes or these relationships from outside of that logic, and what does that new relationality do to open up other ideas about just about seeing and knowing.
And I think that when I sort of think about, or when I think about the sound piece, I also think that the sound piece is not entirely glitch free, right? I mean, there are moments where the sound is falling apart. It's very sort of materiality is kind of crumbling or coming undone. And I think that we were kind of also thinking about Fanon here, what he refers to as, or referred to as, combat breathing, utter political and economic vulnerability, that the very possibility of respiration becomes the ultimate challenge, ensuring that the community is facing development or infrastructural violence. All their capacities are directed towards breathing, nothing else. So I think that is why the sound is textured. It jumps. It's not seamless. It's not glitch free.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think the idea is to really kind of pay attention to these, or to create an oral soundscape that really kind of allows us to come into contact with sensations of disintegration. That, right, of course, human communities who are living in these sacrificial spaces and zones of development are facing, but also jinns and spirits are facing as well, because as the air is changing, they are also unable to breathe. They also have corporeal bodies that are connected to the natural world. And so really to think about how development is affecting both human and more than human worlds, and how breath and air and wind is very much at the center of that.